For nearly 80 years, the Western world believed it had solved history. The Western liberal democracy has triumphed on every front. It defeated fascism in the Second World War, Bolshevism in the Cold War, and emerged as the dominant political force across the world. For decades, it served as a defining pillar of Western identity and became deeply ingrained in the West's perception of itself. The West came to associate itself with its democratic governance. At the same time, the principal political struggle of the modern era was framed as one between democracies and authoritarian regimes. However, in recent years, the West has begun to lose the internal political cohesion that once defined it. The West has seen the rise of political polarization as public trust in institutions continues to decline. The street brawls between various militant left-wing and right-wing groups have been reminiscent of the situation in Germany, Italy, France, and other parts of Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. But what exactly caused the erosion of the political consensus? To fully understand these developments, one must go back to World War II, where the modern political consensus originates. The Second World War was not merely a geopolitical conflict. It was essentially, in many ways, a civil war within the Western world itself. Liberalism, in the broadest sense of the term, represented by the United States and the United Kingdom. Fascism, represented by Germany and Italy, and Marxism, represented by the Soviet Union, competed to shape the future of the world. While the World War I cemented liberalism's victory over the monarchist systems of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the World War II delivered the final blow to the right-wing resistance against the Western liberal democracy. The war became foundational to the modern Western political order. In its aftermath, liberal democracy emerged as the new political consensus throughout the Western world, now united in opposition to the Eastern Bloc and Bolshevism. The victory in the Cold War marked another major milestone for the liberal West. It now reigned supreme across the whole globe, with only isolated pockets of resistance to the liberal project. This led many to believe that the ideological conflict itself was coming to an end. In the early 1990s, thinkers such as Francis Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy represented the pinnacle of human political development, the highest form of political system humanity could create, and that all that remained was its universal expansion across the globe. What was remaining was only a local resistance to the liberal democratic system in places like Libya and Iraq. Fukuyama's idea of the end of history suggested that the ideological evolution of mankind had effectively reached its conclusion with the wide-reaching liberal victory. Internationally, the new consensus came to be defined by open trade, the free flow of capital, multinational corporations, international organizations, and global treaties. Domestically, the center-left and center-right came to dominate the political landscape, both united in their rejection of the political extremism associated with the 1930s and 1940s. However, what exactly caused the current crisis of the liberal order? After the World War II, liberal democracies took a stand not only against authoritarian political systems, but also against much of the traditional order itself. Thinkers such as Theodor Adorno and others from the Frankfurt School, who played a crucial part in shaping the post-war ideological era, even argued that the authoritarian personality originated within traditional family structures, where obedience to authority was first learned. In this view, the traditional family, centered around a father and a mother, became seen as a miniature model for the authoritarian state. This intellectual current gradually pushed Western societies toward the dismantling of traditional norms and the relaxation of social boundaries. It was argued that only the opening of economic, cultural, national, and other boundaries could prevent repetition of the 1930s and 1940s. Nationalism, strong religious authority, social norms, and cultural homogeneity increasingly came to be viewed with suspicion by intellectual and political elites. This transformation reached its cultural peak during the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. The political right, eager to distance itself from any associations with fascism, was inclined to gradually accept many of the post-war assumptions as the price of participation in the new political order, leading to the eventual recognition of the cultural deregulation. Over time, even conservative parties and churches adapted themselves to the new ideological tide and adopted many of its positions. The new zeitgeist, defined by opposition to anything that can invoke even remote associations with fascism, reshaped the political spirit of the post-war era and produced an entirely new generation of conservatism. The victory over fascism became the founding myth of the post-war liberal democratic order. The political ideas increasingly came to be judged according to whether they were perceived as similar to fascism and therefore intrinsically evil, or as fundamentally opposed to it and therefore morally righteous. The post-war political order drew its legitimacy from a victory over fascism, which placed pressure on every political movement seeking entry into respectable politics to constantly prove that it was sufficiently anti-fascist. The conservatives were naturally the primary targets of this campaign. Liberalism was elevated not merely into a political system, but into a broader moral creed. At the same time, the traditional order itself was increasingly thrown under bus, as many feared the return of totalitarianism supposedly rooted in traditional values. The traditional institutions, values, and forms of social organizations were declared as precursors to fascism itself. Opposing fascism came to mean supporting the system that was created in its place to oppose it, while challenging that order became something politically frowned upon and morally suspect. At the crux of this new ideological agenda were liberal philosophers such as Karl Popper. Soon, a new ideological current, postmodernism, began reshaping the outlook of younger generations. At its core was the argument that objective truth, as a political and philosophical category, could neither be fully defined nor universally enforced. Instead, individuals should be free to pursue their own meaning in a fundamentally meaningless relativistic world. Cultural deregulation was seen as the only path forward. This led the foundation for the moral and cultural relativism that shook the Western world during this time. The cultural shift fueled massive demonstrations across the West, most famously the May 1968 protests in Paris. Traditional religion and assertive political philosophies were increasingly rejected as legitimate foundations for public life, while cultural values were redefined as matters of purely individual choice. It marked the beginning of the open society, a concept developed by Karl Popper and later championed by figures such as George Soros, who founded the Open Society Foundation, an international network of NGOs on its mission to promote this new philosophy across the world. The post-war European politics saw the emergence of two dominant political currents, social democracy and Christian democracy. Christian democracy of the post-war era differs significantly from the modern movements often described as a Christian right or Christian nationalism. Christian Democrats largely sought to reconcile Christianity with liberal democracy rather than to restore traditional religious authority. Essentially, they were seeking to justify liberal individual rights through Christian teachings, thereby securing a place of political right within the new post-war order by demonstrating that it was sufficiently committed to open society and liberal democracy. One of the key features of the post-war order was the creation of new international organizations, such as the United Nations, founded with the goal of increasing global cooperation and thus preventing another world war. In a similar way, the foundation of the European Union represented another example of the world moving in a new direction. Although the European project initially began as an economic union designed to ease the hardships of the post-war recovery in continental Europe, the cosmopolitan undertones were never hidden by those leaders who eventually engineered its transformation to a more centralized, supranational political union. The project increasingly sought to overcome nationalism in order to ensure lasting peace in Europe, reflecting several core liberal assumptions: that economic integration and market cooperation would serve as primary guarantees of peace and solutions of international conflicts, as well as the principles of democratic peace theory. The belief that democratic countries are far less likely to go to war with one another, setting the promotion of liberal democracy as one of the primary goals of the European Union. Thus, the post-war world was shaped by a fundamentally new zeitgeist. It brought changes which are unprecedented in history. Part of this unprecedented transformation was a new policy of multiculturalism. The construction of the open society required not only the establishment of new principles, but also the deconstruction of old, so-called closed society, which was rooted in national loyalties, cultural continuity, and ancestral heritage. The attack on the traditional social and cultural norms was accompanied by a new policy of non-European mass immigration. Beginning in the 1950s, many Western countries opened their doors to increasing levels of immigration from the Third World countries. The intellectual and political elites viewed the new immigration policy as a means to deal with the labor shortages and to transform the West from ethnic and cultural homogeneity towards diversity. They argued that the increasing diversity would create the foundation for genuine pluralism, cultural relativism, and open society, which they believed would prevent return to what liberal critics understood as totalitarian uniformity, rooted in ethnic particularism and traditional family values. The project of mass immigration was part of the broader social experiment launched by post-war liberals. In this sense, the new liberals of the post-war era were guided by ideas that differed fundamentally from those of earlier liberal thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, who believed that free societies could only exist within cohesive nation-states built around shared national bonds. However, not even a century has passed since the proclamation of the end of history, and this new experiment is already facing serious challenges that test its very capacity for survival. The same forces that transformed the West into the open societies also slowly began to weaken many of the shared assumptions that once held those societies together. The globalized free trade and flow of capital have raised questions about who truly benefits from a modern economic arrangement and whether local communities have been sacrificed in the process. The mass immigration overseen by Western political elites increasingly created social quagmires such as declining social trust, rising instability, and the gradual erosion of social cohesion across many Western societies. The capitalist elites have become too reliant on foreign cheap labor to replace local workers. The new gender dynamics increasingly prove problematic for the formation of stable families and the maintenance of stable birth rates, while the attack on heteronormativity opened Pandora's box, an endless search for new forms of oppressions and new genders. The dominance of moderation and the narrowing of political boundaries created a class of center-left and center-right politicians who became increasingly indistinguishable in their views on core issues. The new political establishment came to be defined by ideological uniformity and bureaucratic management of social issues rather than a genuine political vision. A new generation of career politicians, often emerging from bureaucratic institutions, NGOs, and technocratic structures, increasingly appeared disconnected from ordinary people and lacking the political instincts traditionally associated with earlier statesmen. They largely served as loyal guardians of the existing political order and dogmatic adherents to the established political norms, in a system where advancement depended on strict ideological obedience. However, the new realities gave rise to challenges that could no longer be effectively ignored. The mass immigration, worsening economic problems, and intensifying cultural conflicts were dismissed by establishment politicians, but this only led to political outsiders taking up the mantle of opposition against the growing ideological uniformity of the post-war order. These new political forces emerged largely as protest movements, defined by their populist character. Establishment politicians responded to the rising tide in an uncompromising manner, framing it as a historical battle between good and evil, between liberal democracy and fascism itself. Rather than treating these movements as expressions of genuine social and political concerns deserving serious examination and engagement, many establishment figures instead portrayed them as manifestations of phobias and moral crimes that had to be firmly rejected and denounced. Establishment figures did not shy away from labeling the millions supporting these protest politicians with the terms such as deplorables. Yet despite this resistance, populist movements steadily gained ground across all Western countries, particularly on the political right, ushering the electoral politics into a new era. The establishment parties on the right were forced to either adapt or risk being sidelined altogether. At the same time, many of these new political forces faced their own internal rebellion for not adhering to the declared principles, leading to the emergence of competing parties and tendencies, showing a growing desire for a genuine change. Simultaneously, new forces on the political left also began challenging the established order, criticizing its liberal foundations and pushing for a more radical shift further to the left. These new political forces proved especially popular among the young rank and file on both sides of the political spectrum, with youth once again emerging as the primary engine of political activism and social change, as has so often been the case throughout history. Both left-wing and right-wing populist forces increasingly question the supposedly positive effects of global economic liberalization. Ultimately, the rise of populist opposition reflected the growing dissatisfaction not merely with individual policies, but with the post-war consensus itself, which many increasingly came to view as decadent and dysfunctional, incapable of addressing the realities of the modern era. Thus, the new crisis in the Western world is being shaped by several factors. It is driven by the erosion of cultural norms and traditional societal bonds, as well as declining ethnic and cultural solidarity amid growing diversity and social fragmentation. These developments have increasingly led many to question the entire post-war political project that introduced this form of cultural relativism into Western societies. The deterioration of economic conditions provides another major explanation. The rise of transnational corporations has increasingly undermined traditional communities, weakening national and cultural ties while reducing social relations to purely transactional exchanges. At the same time, younger generations on the political left have also grown increasingly dissatisfied with neoliberal global economics, further intensifying the polarization of the political spectrum. Ultimately, the rise of these new political forces and the growing pressure placed upon the center-left and center-right raise a deeper question. Will liberal democracy itself eventually be sidelined, much as Rome abandoned its republican system amid deep political crisis? Or will liberal democracy survive only in a significantly altered form? These questions will likely be answered over the coming decades. As the continued erosion of the cultural, ethnic, and social foundations of traditional Western societies increasingly challenges the post-war liberal assumption that societies do not require shared ethno-cultural bonds and collective cohesion in order to function smoothly. This crisis was in many ways anticipated nearly a century ago by thinkers such as Oswald Spengler, although he held a deeply pessimistic view of the future of the West, seeing the rise of Caesarism as a final stage preceding Western decline. Some of his intellectual successors, such as Francis Parker Yockey, envisioned a different future for Western cultural development, one that would leave an even stronger Western imprint on world history. Ultimately, it'll be the coming decades that'll determine which direction Western civilization takes. The central question of the 21st century may ultimately be this: can the post-war liberal order survive the social, cultural, and economic pressures now building against it? Or is the West entering an entirely new political era?